I was told a strong indicator that I'm autistic is how I think about empathy.
Definitely go and watch the rest of Chris's video. I think it was very relatable for me as a person who's actually very empathetic in many different ways, or the different forms of empathy, which I'll go and explain in this video for a bit. But the way that Chris describes empathy in his way is definitely not wrong. The person who's actually assessing him or talking about and saying that he has a wrong understanding of empathy is actually wrong and doesn't understand that there's different forms of empathy when it comes to the actual understanding or definition of empathy. So, cognitive empathy is something that was kind of said a lot in the comments of the original video for Chris. And this is something that a lot of autistic people can experience. And this is something for me that I personally have the most when it comes to empathy, as well as other forms of empathy that I'll go into for myself at least. But for cognitive empathy, this is something you may see a lot for a few autistic people who express in a way where it's very rationalized and it comes from a very logical standpoint, because that's, for me, like as an example for an autistic person, is that for my brain, I have to rationalize, I have to logically break down and process what somebody is going through in order to feel, in order to process how somebody is feeling and what is happening in their life. And for the assessor, I think what they're explaining, and Chris also kind of talks about in a follow-up video, is that for autistic people and neurotypical people, supposedly they can just naturally feel those emotions, or somebody who is empathetic can naturally feel those things without having to logically understand them. But I really think that's inaccurate, because when it comes to emotional empathy, which is the type of empathy that most people think about or understand is empathy when they hear empathy, is the emotional side of it, where you could feel, or supposedly you have the feelings and can express those feelings of what somebody else is going through, and putting yourself in the same position without having to process or think about what they're saying or what they're doing. But for compassionate empathy, that is a combination of understanding somebody's issues as well as trying to logically understand where they're coming from, but then also having a strong desire to help and alleviate someone's suffering. And I think this is very common for a few autistic people, and I know specifically for myself and for my friends too, is that when we have an issue, I will automatically try to offer you practical solutions, things that will help alleviate your problem. And a lot of the times, in those positions, I've had friends be very upset with me because they think that I'm not listening to them. They think that I'm I'm coming off as a very cold person, or like I'm not actually empathizing with them because I'm offering all these different solutions. And I understand that a lot of people don't, in some instances, they don't want to hear solutions. They just want to vent, and that's totally understandable. But I think for myself as an autistic person, because I have to logically process what's going on when it comes to empathy, I have to understand somebody's perspective, really what's going on, and in order to share that feeling. I also then, once I share or understand and feel that feeling from the emotional empathy side, then I can really come from a compassionate side where I really just want to help, and therefore I provide all of these different solutions in order to help somebody. And then with effective empathy, this is where you can automatically mirror somebody else's emotions, experiencing what they're feeling without necessarily understanding why. And this is something I feel like I suffer from, and I really don't like when it comes to empathy, is that I can actually really feel other people's emotions. So much so that it overwhelms me and I have to leave the room. In a lot of cases, especially when somebody is anxious or overwhelmed and it's very obvious, it is something that I can really feel, and it becomes my own anxiety in a sense. And I know I'm not anxious. I'm not doing anything, like saying I'm relaxing, but then my husband's being anxious from cooking. It will it will very much affect me and irritate me, and I would have to remove myself because my body starts to feel extremely anxious from hearing and seeing somebody else's own anxiety. Somatic empathy isn't something that I personally experience, but it's when you can physically feel sensations or pains of others as if they were your own. And that means, like, in a case, if somebody you were close to, or even depending on people, somebody can feel like if somebody is sick or somebody is in pain, then some people can actually feel that physical effect to it. I personally don't have that, or I don't have much of that. I can feel that to a degree when it comes to loved ones, but in general, if it's somebody of who's a stranger, then I don't have somatic empathy. But yeah, I think this conception that autistic people are actually very unempathetic is really not true. In a lot of cases, if we actually look at the different forms of empathy, many autistic people are actually empathetic, but it comes from a very cognitive standpoint or a compassionate empathy rather than the emotional side of it, and being able to emote and to be automatically feeling those emotions, especially because some autistic people do struggle with alexithymia and understanding their own emotions and processing that, as well as processing and understanding the expressions of emotions from other people or strangers. So I really think that there needs to be more discussions about what empathy actually is and how it's not just about feeling feelings, but understanding where somebody is coming from. And personally, I think out of all the forms of empathy, the most important one is cognitive empathy, because it's one thing that, yes, you can feel somebody's emotions, but if you can't understand where they're coming from, if you can't really put yourself in their position and come from a place where you're like, my gosh, if I were in your position and I could understand what you're going through, that makes me extremely empathetic. That makes me feel like I can understand and really want to help this person in need. And again, that's coming more from a cognitive or compassionate empathy. But for me, I've always felt like that is where the kindness, or where stronger forms of empathy are more impactful to me as a person. If somebody is just feeling what I'm feeling, but isn't able to help me to understand my own feelings or help to understand what I'm going through and really be there for me, whether it is an emotional side or understand and process what I'm going through, then that to me is just sympathy. It's not really going to connect in a way that is truly showing empathy.